Thanks very much, Guy. It's a pleasure to be here and to be asked to wrap up and to have the podium back. What I'm going to do in wrapping up is to return to the goal of the event, which is to highlight and elaborate the importance of access to information for all sustainable development efforts around the world. That's taken from the brochure. The presentations that we've had have kind of covered this at three levels. The first is at a very simple physical level, in a sense, and that is whether or not people have access to the tools and instruments that enable them to access information that they need. We've heard about poor people who lack even information about the use of the resource or the squandering of their resources, if you like, not realizing where and how it is spent. A number of speakers pointed to the internet and to social media as partly a solution, a major part of the solution around this, opening a window to the world. And there are those, especially in the corporate sector, I have to say, who would tell us that if only everybody had a smartphone and access to broadband, that all the problems of access to information would, if you like, be solved. And that brings us to the second level, because it's really not about simply access to information. It's about access to the right information, getting that information to the right people, and for that matter, the people having the right to access that information. This opens up a far more complex debate about what it means, access to information, the right to information, and most of the presentations and all of the presenters in different ways are related to this. Certainly, information must be available, and that means that people must have the right to access it. It must be useful and timely, and we heard that, produced when you need it, not before, not after. It must be usable, and people must have the capacity and the support, as we heard, for instance, around libraries, to use that information. We also heard quite a lot about what access to information does not mean. If you like, access to the wrong information, distortion, deliberate distortion of news and information. I too don't like the term fake news. I think we should call it what it is. It is distortion, and it's deliberate distortion. The proprietary ownership of information, overuse of copyright, which is barely mentioned, but certainly is an issue for libraries, but for many others as well. Information that is generated solely for the purposes of maximizing profits, which introduces a very particular type of distortion into the information that gets out there. And then, of course, several references to the whole issue of surveillance of Facebook, of the culture bubbles that are created, and of that whole use of information through social media, the secondary, if you like, for some, the primary use of that information, the owners of the social media, which is becoming a major concern. And both enabling the positive sides of that and, if you like, minimizing or disabling the negative sides. I think everybody was in agreement around the issue of the need for the rule of law, the need for the right governance context for media. In other words, access to information in itself is meaningless. It's got to be in a supportive context, that it's that context that gives it meaning. And without that, it is simply not. Even the right institutions, it has to be said. You might have a great institution for access to information, but without the right context and without the right culture, in the case of gender, as we heard, it's not enough for access to information to become meaningful. So there are loads of challenges in that much, but let's just for the moment assume that many of these are being addressed, and that in some places at different times, that at least a meaningful access to information is happening. Is it enough? Will people, when they have access to this information, be able to, if you like, use their own abilities, their own context to address the issues that we're talking about here, the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, we also heard that Sustainable Development Goals are not for governments alone to deliberate about. They are also for people to force governments to act, and they are also for civil society, for NGOs, for the private sector, and for everybody else. So in a sense, there is an underlying idea here that if you have access to information, you can simply act on it and thereby the SDGs come about. It's not like that. The SDGs are going to come about, if they come about, and to the extent that they come about, through collective action. And that does not mean people accessing information that they use to simply achieve it. It's not a simple equation like that. It's far more complex. And that brings us to the third level, which was also referred to by quite a number of speakers in different ways. And the third level, to me, if I can sum it up, is that information without dialogue is a one-way street. Information is empowered through interaction with others. In other words, that one-sided notion of access to information, you get the information, you use it, really is one-sided. In order to transform that information into useful action, it's got to be in dialogue, it's got to be in communication. And if the SDGs are to be realized, it is going to have to, access to information to gain its full meaning is going to have to go an awful lot further. So it's not just freedom of expression, which is, if you like, the sister of access to information, but the right to be listened to. You have the information, you express your views. Have you a right to be listened to? Have you a right to a response when you are listened to? And is there a right then to a dialogue that goes beyond that? Some people would call it a right to communicate with others. If the SDGs are to be achieved, and this was, I think, hinted at by quite a few, you have to go further. You have to break the current paradigm and go that extra bit further to ensure that the full cycle of communication between people and government, civil society and so on is completed. Access to information is the first major expression of that. It's the first major step that has to be taken, but it has to go a lot further. And Irina Bokova at the very beginning said, for the people, with the people, and by the people. That last bit, by the people, is only when you have that full communication cycle operating. We also heard that good governance, in the end, is where the idea of corruption is not even a temptation, because dialogue is so deep that it simply doesn't enter into it as a factor. And that, again, is about access to information turning into its powerful future, which is as dialogue and communication. And because there are no closed doors in the rooms of power. I would say as well that IPDC actually has a proud history in this. And there are several areas the last couple of speakers especially emphasized. Amy and Gwen, for instance, talked about the role of media in transforming access to information into a dialogue between people and governance. I believe that this is central in taking it, one of the central issues in taking it to the next level. The idea of community-owned media, something that IPDC has been extremely involved in promoting. The idea of different forms of media in which people can through which people can express themselves. These are ways in which that cycle can be completed, and you will move towards influencing power and the SDGs. Independent media, as Amy called it, but I would go further and say it's got to be independent of all interests other than those of the collective interests of people. The IPDC Talks as well has a key role here, I think, in raising these issues. And certainly, if I look to the future of IPDC Talks, there's one point I want to raise, and I feel entitled to do it here, I suppose because nobody else mentioned it, and yet people got quite close to it at one time, and that is the link between access to information, ICTs, and the internet. Let's call it something else. Let's call it access to aggregate information. You've all heard of big data, which essentially is the aggregation of information that people use, that businesses use, and so on, and then is put to further use in various sectors. One of the big dangers at the moment is that when we talk about access to information, we don't really talk much about who has access to that information that has been concentrated into the hands of big data and of aggregate information. I think this is one of the topics that is going to be very influential in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals as we get closer to the real facts of trying to achieve the targets. Because we see that this kind of information is being used to transform many, many sectors, from agriculture to health to the management of cities and so on. And yet, the amount of dialogue that is involved in that big data, in the aggregation of that data and what it's used for, is extremely minimal at this time, and there is virtually no public oversight of it. So I mentioned that as one area that might, I think, be relevant for IPDC talks in the future. I'm going to finish on that and again just emphasize, I think the very fact that so many people are watching and listening in different places around the world, the format seems to be working. There's huge interest in this. I think the issue is of great interest, and we really have to go on raising the questions if we are to seriously link access to information, media and communication to Sustainable Development Goals. A lot more talking is going to have to go on. Thanks very much.